Okay, so yesterday we've learned the basics of JavaScript. Today, we're going to do pretty much the same thing again, just with Python. It's going to be all the same concepts, just in a different language with slightly different syntax. So just like in JavaScript, we're going to be manipulating different types of data, such as numbers and lists. And if you want to understand how you can manipulate your data and compare it to other data, the most important thing to understand is the type of your data. So many of these are going to be similar to the types that we use in JavaScript, but there are a few important differences that I'll point out as we get to them. So our first type is numbers. These are pretty similar to how they were in JavaScript. Let's just make a literal number here. I've assigned the number 4, literal 4, to a variable. So already though, just in this first line of code, we can notice a few small differences between Python and JavaScript. So first of all, in Python, unlike JavaScript, we don't use any keywords for defining a variable. So you just have a variable name equals value. It's much simpler. Python is not going to accidentally create global variables, so you don't have to be quite as cautious declaring variables in Python like we do in JavaScript. Now, also, you might have noticed that the name looks a little bit different. So if this was JavaScript, I would have chosen a name kind of like this, with camel case is what this is called. You can notice the humps sort of in the letters going up and down. The S is capitalized, N is capitalized. That's the JavaScript style. In Python, just everything is snake themed in Python. Python developers are huge nerds and they love snakes, I guess. So we use snake case for writing our variables, where everything is lowercase, and then we have underscores in between the words.
How important is it to keep up with that convention? Is that a cultural thing, or is it going to break code?
It's not going to break code, like as long as you use the correct variable name when you're referring to something that's already defined, nothing's going to break. But this is very strongly cultural. I'd say if you show up for an interview and you are doing a problem in Python and you start writing your variables like in camel case, the interviewer is going to assume that you're not really a Python developer, that you're primarily a JavaScript developer, and you just pick this up over a weekend and you're kind of pretending to be a Python developer. So writing your variables like this just makes it look like you're part of the community. Because realistically, if you had read thousands and thousands of lines of Python code, this is just automatically how you would write your variables because it's the first thing you would think to do.
Fair enough.
So yeah, they just want to look like you want to look like it's familiar to you. You're part of the community. Cool. So I was saying before, if we want to know the types of variables, that's really important. So Python actually gives us a handy function that tells us the types of things. Note that in JavaScript, there's also a way to get the types of things. There's the type of operator, but since technically everything in JavaScript is an object, it's often much less useful than you would hope it would be. Whereas Python, in a lot of ways, is a much saner language. everything has a meaningful type. And so this type function built into JavaScript is going to often give us useful information about our variables. So I'll open my terminal here. All right, so here I got the type of a small number, and it's telling me that it is an integer. So that's roughly what I would expect, so that's cool. Let's see if I say this is 4.4. Now it's a float. So I didn't actually have to declare anything different. I just write a literal number and assign it to a variable. But under the hood, Python is doing a little bit of work automatically and actually declaring these as different types of numbers. So Python is a little bit more sophisticated in some ways like that. So just like in JavaScript, we can manipulate numbers using numeric operators.
Hey, Raphael, would you mind closing your Explorer so we can have a bigger main screen? Thank you.
You're welcome. So this is exactly the same as it is in JavaScript. So I'm not going to review it again. Math is basically the same in any programming language where you're just using floats. Although note, there is no triple equals or not double equals. There's only double equals and single not equals. Because Python is never going to do that automatic type coercion for you. It needs values to be of the same type in order to compare them. So that's why it just doesn't have those extra operators. And I think that's great. Just makes Python simpler, more reliable, less opportunities for errors. All right,
so it treats everything as a triple equals, basically?
Correct.
Okay.
All right, so we got numbers. We've also got strings. So these are, again, pretty similar to how strings work in JavaScript. A couple minor differences. I saw a couple hands up.
Yeah, I just had a quick question. I remember reading online, trying to find the differences between a lot of coding languages. And is this the reason that it's doing these little conversions and trying to interpret it at a higher level, that Python is considered slower than C++ and all that kind of thing? Why would we not use this in any kind of situation for Python? Because it seems from what I've read, it's the most versatile. Most people are learning this right now.
You're saying Python is most versatile?
Yeah, it's just really easy to learn and it's versatile and everything like that. But slow or something.
Yeah, it does have a reputation as being slower than some other programming languages. But in my opinion, all modern programming languages are fast enough. And if your web application is slow, it's not because you should have picked a faster programming language, but some engineer made a poor decision in architecting the application. You're doing something very efficiently, and it's not limited by just the speed of your programming language. Unless you have to do tons of math, and that's what's really taking a lot of time, but that's not commonly the problem that web applications face. So, I mean, and like you said, Python is very flexible. And if you don't need the very fastest performance, then the flexibility is really what matters most.
That's good, thank you.
I'm sorry, what did you say?
I just said thank you. Sounds
Okay,
good.
cool, you're welcome. Was there another question?
That was me. That was me that had my hand up. So I ran into a problem back when I was trying to use Python. I had a user put input and then try to run a a mathematical problem using his input, but it kept running it as a string. Can I change the type into a number from his input? And if so, how would that go about doing that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Wait, you said you wanted, hold on. Okay, so here a small number is the string 4.4, and we're going to call int on it and turn it into a real number. And what? Oh, of course, this 4.4 is not an integer. Am I
I'm calling a
missing-
small number. You're printing a small number.
Oh my gosh, you're right. Okay. So I did not actually modify my original value. I created a new variable and I was just printing the type of the wrong thing. So here we're going to print type of a real number. Great. So small number is the letter 4, and I call int on that to turn it into an integer. And then I check the type of that, a real number, and that's going to tell me it's an integer. So the problem you notice is that whatever input the user types in is always a string. Even if they're typing, the numbers on the top row of their keyboard, when you assign that to a variable, it's going to be a string. Anything off the user's keyboard is a string. So if you think that it should be a number, other parts of your program need to interpret it as a number, then this is how you can do that. I guess. Float. So yeah. Do we have another hand up?
Yes, I have a question. Following along with that, so is every programming language with user input always interpreted as a string, or is there other programming languages that will accept a number as the input?
I haven't encountered any programming language where it can accept input and automatically interprets it as a number.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I've seen this maybe like 3 or 4 different times in different languages, and this is a pretty common step. You take the input as a string, convert it into a different format as necessary.
Thank you.
Yep. There is another hand up. Dalton?
Did you, so I know you can't, it wouldn't let you turn the 4.4 into an int, but say you had, like it was a whole number and you put float, is it more inclusive? Will it turn the 4 into a float?
I think so, yeah. So yeah, now we have the floating point number 4.0. So yeah, that's a little more flexible, more generic, or maybe you want to be more specific and you use int. So it just depends on your needs.
So in his specific case, it'd probably make more sense to do float, since technically if they could, well, I guess it'd matter if they could put in a non, but if you put in, say, an int, but they actually give you a decimal, then your program probably wouldn't run, correct?
Say the last bit again.
So like, so because he was trying to convert it, so if you were to go in and put it as an int, but say they put in a floating number like 4.2 or whatever they put in, would that break the program?
Yeah,
I'm
that would
assuming?
crash. I mean, just like what you saw here. I had 4.4. I set this to int. And Python throws an error. Invalid literal for int with base 10, 4.4. So that just halts my program. Nothing else can happen after this line fails to run.
And does Python have the same issue with as long as you define it as a float from doing math like in JavaScript, how it just completely like you can't add back and get the same value, for example, or like whatever it is with floats? Or can Python properly track floating digits and everything and properly do math?
Python might actually struggle with this as well. I know there are other like math libraries for Python that people use, which are probably better and more precise. And like Python has other types as well. Like there's a decimal type, I believe, in Python. Um, so I haven't used this extensively, but they describe the advantages. Oh, wait, hold on. Yeah, so this is actually the situation specifically that I've talked about, 1.1 plus 2.2. So yeah, 0.1 plus 0.2 still gives you the same problem in Python, just using the basic float type. But apparently there's this built-in library, built-in package called decimal in Python that you can use. And so there are yet more number types that have specific decimal precision. So only 2 decimal places, for example. So it looks like someone has thought of some solutions to the problem. They exist in Python, not with these basic numbers, but if we need more precision, that tool is available to us in Python. All right, any other questions, or can we continue? All right. So talking about strings in Python, strings are pretty similar in Python to how they are in JavaScript. At least to the extent that we're going to talk about them today, they're pretty similar. You can have strings enclosed in single quotes. You can have strings enclosed in double quotes. Of course, all strings have the type string. So we can see there, class is string. But where things are going to get a little bit different is with the backtick strings. So remember in JavaScript, we had these kinds of strings and backticks. And these were nice for 2 reasons. They let us break our string onto multiple lines, and they also let us insert variables into our string. So in Python, there's a different way that we're going to approach those problems. So let's say if we just want to have a multi-line string, okay, great. So that is also a string. And I can print it out. It preserves the formatting. I guess it preserved the indentation too. So there's that same kind of problem that we saw in JavaScript. Cool. And then I also mentioned about variable interpolation. So sometimes you want to put a variable into a string. So we have a slightly different way of accomplishing that in Python. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create what's called an F string, where you type the letter F and then make a string. But then inside of this string, I can put variables. So I'll type So you can see it has inserted the variables day and activity into my string. So this is very similar to the syntax we use in JavaScript, except we're just using regular double quotes instead of the backticks. And then we put an F in front of our string, again, instead of using backticks. And then to insert variables, we're just using curly braces instead of the $curly brace syntax. So again, for reference in JavaScript, this would have looked like question?
Is there a name for that F?
What do you mean?
Like, is that F called something? Being behind that string?
They would call this an F string.
Can you use single quotes with that, or is it always double quotes?
I believe either. I've always seen it in double quotes, but let's see what happens.
You said it's called string interpolation, is that right?
Correct. What did I just break?
You have an apostrophe verlets. So when you use a single quotes,
Yeah. Classic. So yeah, it looks like it works exactly the same way.
All right, thank you.
Dan, do you have a question?
Yeah, so I was reviewing some of the Python lesson pre-work, and I was going over one of the lessons. Let me roll back that way. When you were printing out certain variable types, like share the screen. Can they hear me? Is it all right? Well, I'm using this. So you would use like the percentage or modular operand to like print so like printing like if you have like a string like a string named my string, and you're trying to print that within another string, they used a percentage s and then another percent sign, and then inputted the let me take a screen capture of this. First. Like instead of doing the string interpolation the way you did it, they used but so they did like a percentage s within their string. So
yeah, so that's how it used to be done for everything before Python 3.6. So the new F string way is just a updated version. But yeah, the way you're talking about is called string formatting, and you use like a percent s, and then you give the string that you're throwing in there, and you have to make sure you throw them in the correct order and all that stuff at the end. It definitely makes it a lot harder.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. I'm trying to find an example.
So if you had like two variables in there, you'd do percent s in the string, and then you'd have to make sure that you list the variables at the end in the correct order.
So yeah, this is kind of the old syntax for what I'm showing you now. In my opinion, this is a lot harder to read than the more modern way.
okay, yeah, that's what I was seeing.
Can we just disregard that way of doing it, that method of doing it? Or should we know both?
So you can disregard this in Python, but this is actually going to come back later on. So this just general concept of like replacing variables into strings using percent s, that exists in other languages aside from Python. And this might come up later again in SQL, at least.
And it's also really good to know for any code that you're provided that was written before Python 3.6. Just maybe not something you would want to write in the future, but something you definitely need to understand.
Definitely.
Okay, thanks.
All right, do we have any other questions?
I have a question. I'm trying to follow along with what you're doing. And when I type it in, it's not accepting the, like what the activity or day would be. It's not printing it out as like, as you're saying it's supposed to be printed out. I'm not quite sure if it's an issue with my computer or why mine is not coming out the same way as yours.
And this is what you got in your editor, and you're running the file, not seeing any output?
No, it keeps saying that it's saying that there's an issue with the syntax because of that apostrophe at the end, and I have it written exactly like yours.
Did you escape this first apostrophe or this second apostrophe?
I did.
I'm not sure offhand. Might have to take a look at it.
Real quick, when you're running your program, are you running it as Python 3? Because that could be the issue.
It's a good
How
point.
do I run it as Python 3?
So like, with JavaScript, when you would run it, you'd do like node, then the file name.
Oh,
On
so it needs to be Python 3
and then
then
yes,
the name of the file.
correct. Try that.
Okay, I thought the alias thing that we did that in general. Okay.
Yeah, that's what I thought too, but it didn't work on mine either. So I always just type Python 3.
You might not have the alias set up
And that
correctly.
fixed it.
Huh. So yeah, one thing you can do to check is type Python at your terminal like this. And so here it's telling me Python is alias to Python 3. I can type Python 3 and that tells me that's where that is. But so this tells me that it's actually using my alias when I type Python, and it's not just
Okay,
using
so I
my
need to
system
redo the
version.
alias.
Potentially, yeah.
Okay,
We can figure that out afterwards.
okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Does Python follow PEMDAS as well?
Yes.
I have a question as well about your multi-line string. I can't pull it off. I mean, how many quotes do you have there?
3 double quotes to open and close it.
Well, I mean, it's just not working for me.
That's unusual. And you're sure you're using Python 3?
Yes, I am. I guess
and so you like start their triple quotes on the same line as the equal sign here? Because like if I try to break it down like that, this is invalid. I just need the triple quotes on this first line and then everything else can be under it. Yeah. I don't know, maybe we should take this offline. We can figure it out after the lecture. What's going on?
all right, that'll work then.
All right. But yeah, in theory, the triple quote strings, multi-line strings are useful if you have a paragraph that you need to explain. Something doesn't fit in a one-line string.
I was going to say, I think some of the configuration settings they're having is because in the install fest, it wanted you to update your bash profile, but in Mac with the most recent release, bash isn't your standard shell. It's the ZCH, whatever. You have to modify that profile in order, or every time go into bash. But I think if you just go to bash, it doesn't initialize it. You have to do the source to initialize it.
Yeah, I think you're correct. I'm not sure why my machine isn't like that because this is a fairly new computer. I want to say it's just like minutes older than yours or whatever. But my config file is the bash profile. But you're right, for many people on newer systems, the default shell was updated from bash to ZSRH. So you would be looking for a file at //.zsr ZSHRC. Yeah. So instead of bash underscore profile, you would need .zshrc as your config file, but you could put the same alias code in there.
Terrence, are you getting an error or is it just not printing?
No, actually, disregard what I said. I was printing the wrong string.
Cool.
Yeah, it works now. Thank you.
Awesome. All right, so those are strings. Not much more to say beyond what I just showed you. Also got Booleans. So Booleans in Python are pretty similar to JavaScript, except spell them with capital letters, true and false, instead of the all lowercase versions in JavaScript. And then also, the logical comparison operators are a little bit different, but we'll get to that a little bit later. But so 99% Booleans are the same in Python as in JavaScript. So let's get to some more interesting data types. So for our complex data types, the first one is a list. So the list is essentially, it's roughly equivalent to an array in JavaScript. So it's just an ordered list of values. So even though it's roughly equivalent to an array in JavaScript, honestly, Python lists are much better. They're just more flexible, more powerful than a JavaScript array, even though JavaScript arrays are also very powerful. So sometimes when you hear people talk about how much they love Python, one of the things that they're talking about are Python lists. They're just really a lot nicer than lists in other programming languages, and they give you a lot of cool features. So let me give you an example of a list here. Well, so there is a list of berries. Just for your knowledge, apparently these botanically are considered berries, even though they are not intuitively what you would think of as berries. But already, this should look pretty familiar to you from how we would declare a similar structure in JavaScript. So not only does it serve a similar purpose of being an ordered list of values, but it even uses the same syntax. It's just a comma separated list of anything we want in between square brackets. We check the type of it. That's tells us it is a list. Now let's see some more information, see what we can do with our list. So as usual, we can index into our list. If I want to get, well, let me give you all a pop quiz. Which item from the list is this going to print?
Tomato.
Yeah. So don't forget, we're still 0 indexed. Python and JavaScript are the same in that regard, that arrays start at 0. There are very few programming languages where arrays don't start at 0 and people generally don't like them. So yeah, berries at 1 is the tomato. Here's something really cool. berries at -1, this is going to give us the first item from the end. So this should show us pumpkin. Now note that when you're accessing the end of the array, it is actually one indexed. -1 is the last item, -2 is the second to last item, because you can't have -0. So that doesn't really make sense. But yeah, so this is a nifty little shortcut that Python provides us for accessing the last element of the array of the list. Very convenient. In JavaScript, we would have to do something really awkward, like we'd have to access the length of the berries array. But since the array is 0 indexed, the index whose number is the length of the array is actually 1 past the array. So we have to subtract 1 from it. So this is in JavaScript how you would select the last element from the array, which doesn't look quite as pretty as the Python version. All right. So I also showed you in JavaScript, there was the slice method for arrays that lets you take a subsection of the array, create a new array based on it. That is such a common and useful thing to do that Python actually has that functionality built into the list syntax itself. So I say berries, and then I index 2:4. The colon indicates a slice. So the 2 is where we start from, and then the 4 is where we end. So this is our sliced array, or our sliced list on line 31. So I started at 2, 0, 1, 2. So we skipped these 3, or I'm sorry, 0, 1. We skipped these 2, and we start at item 2 until number 4, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, is where we stop right before. Dang it. So that leaves us with a new list of just cucumber and eggplant. Similarly, if you omit either the start or the end, then it just means from the beginning or until the end. So berries :3 will slice from start to index 3. And then on the flip side, do a slice like 2:, this slices from index 2 to the end. So let's just see those in action. Cool, so this is my slice for the start of the array, start to 3. This is my slice for the end of the list, from 2 to the end. That's cool. Again, this is just scratching the surface of what lists are capable of. We're going to dive much deeper into all the wonderful things you can do with lists later on. But for now, I think this is enough. Does anyone have any questions about lists before we move on?
Yeah, so just to clarify, so the first number, it includes the index at that number, but the second number, it excludes. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's a little bit tricky at first. And I can never remember which way it goes, like which side is inclusive and which side is exclusive. So I usually test it out. But yeah, the different bounds don't work exactly the same way.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right, any other list questions?
I think that same circumstance happens in JavaScript when you use like slice,
It does.
stuff like that. Yeah.
Yep,
It's usually inclusive of the first and then exclusive of the last. Yeah.
that sounds about right.
It's pretty consistent.
So similarly in the, with just the colon, so like :3 would grab 0, 1, and 2, right?
Yes,
Okay.
that's what it appears to be doing. All right, so we got another data type. The tuple. So a tuple in Python is like a list, but we define it with parentheses instead of square brackets. So does anyone know offhand what the difference is between a tuple and a list, or why it's even called a tuple?
Is a tuple unmutable?
You had one letter off in there, I'm sorry. Immutable is the word you're looking for.
Mhm.
Can you tell me what that means?
It means that it can't be modified once it's declared.
Yeah,
You can't change anything in it?
yeah. Can we think of another way to word that? Cannot be changed, modified, cannot be
Unchangeable.
Redefined?
Mutated.
Mutated.
cannot be mutated. Yeah, so my point here is that I think a lot of people stumble upon this word immutable and they just think it's this like bizarre piece of programming jargon that they've never heard before and they need to like read a book to understand what it means and how to use it. And I think a lot of people are really bad at explaining what immutable means, and they just go right to explaining like why it's important and not like what the word means. But yeah, so my point is this is a word you already know. Immutable data cannot be mutated. So just to get a quick example of that, say we have a tuple for days of the week. Right.
You put Sunday twice.
I just like 3-day weekends. All right.
Nope, you're giving us a 3-day weekend and you can't change it.
All right, so there's the actual days of the week. I swear I passed kindergarten. So it tells us it is a type tuple. Now, if I try to assign a new variable here, so I want to do like days of the week 6 equals Saturday. Python knows what I'm trying to do, and it's like, no, you can't do that. Tuple objects do not support item assignment. Just whatever it is to begin with, that's what it's going to be, and I cannot change it ever. Which kind of makes sense, in this case, because the days of the week are something that don't change very often, or it hasn't happened in my lifetime. It's probably not going to happen anytime soon. So like if you have a list in your code for days of the week and something changes that list, that was probably a mistake. So it might be best to start out with a data structure that cannot be changed. So possibly another example of when you might use a tuple is, I think, for like geographical coordinates.
So the tuple is defined by the parentheses as opposed to the brackets?
Correct.
Okay.
So that just turns my tuple into a list. That turns my list back into a tuple.
What if you have a list of tuples?
What about it?
The list itself allows changing, but since each individual index is a tuple, they can't be changed, but I guess they can be moved around within the list. Kind of a weird, I don't know. Am I getting ahead of myself?
I think you could change what data is in that index, but not the data inside the tuple.
All right, so here are our list of tuples. This is a list. And so if I want, I can rearrange the items, or I can add more items. That's valid. But what I can't do is change any of these individual items here. So I couldn't say list of tuples. Let's see. So here I can do list of tuples 0 equals 0, 1. So that's legit. All right, so originally a list of tuples at 0 was this 3, 4, and I have replaced it with this 0, 1 tuple. And so we can see in my list of tuples, I've updated the first item. Because I haven't actually changed this tuple, I've just replaced it with something entirely different. This spot in this list of tuples at 0, is now pointing to a different tuple. So what I cannot do So this is what I cannot do. Because list of tuples at 1 is a tuple. It's this guy. And so then list of tuples at 1 at 0 is going to be this number 5. That's inside the tuple. So I cannot reassign that value.
So it seems like the tuple contents are safe from, cannot be changed, are immutable, but the tuple itself can be overridden. So days of the week in and of itself can be reassigned another tuple.
I mean, imagine it's like I don't know, these tuples are like snow globes, you know, you're not going to open it up and like touch the stuff inside of it, but you could just throw the entire thing in the trash.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so you gotta be careful because the variable is not.
But if you had a tuple of tuples, then you can't reassign one of the elements in the tuple, right?
Right. So if I, now I have a tuple of tuples. And so now it's complaining about line 46. So we already knew this didn't work, but even before that, it's complaining about line 46. This is not working because, you know, the top level data structure is a tuple, and I'm trying to replace one of the elements of that tuple. Cool.
There is a workaround. So like if your home location changed, where you could just change that tuple variable to a list, make the change, and then change it back to a tuple.
If you wanted to just modify like one element here, you're saying?
Yeah, so for instance, you had the idea of making your program where your home location's a tuple, and then you didn't foresee that you were going to move. And so you want to update that, you could change my home location to a list, make the change, and then change it back to a tuple. So it's immutable again.
So, so that would work. You could do that, but I just want to clarify that my intention in using a tuple for my home address is not that my address doesn't change. It's just that you wouldn't logically change one of these without the other, because this isn't really like a list of two values. Like 34 doesn't mean anything without 97. It's both of these numbers together represents one place. So if I was going to move somewhere else, I would rather just throw out this entire tuple and replace it with a new one instead of modifying the numbers inside of it. It's kind of a semantic difference, and it's a little bit subjective, I guess. It depends on how you want to think about the code, but this is how I want to think about the code and how I think about GPS coordinates. We had another hand up.
It was, I just was gonna ask, can you just assign it to a new tuple, but you already answered it.
Cool.
I actually had a question also. So is the difference between lists and tuples, I mean, obviously the way they're written with the square brackets and the parentheses, but and tuples are immutable, but does like everything else work the same? Like you can still slice them and anything else you would want to do with like a list?
Pretty sure.
So you would really only use a tuple like when you don't want the data to be like manipulated or changed or anything.
Right. So this is interesting. So I took a slice out of list of tuples. Let's see. So it gives me the tuples I asked for, but it returns them as a list. Or wait, hold on, no, that's not.
Yeah, I think your list is a list.
Yeah, let's try something else. Okay, so print days of the week. This is a better example. Okay, yeah, so if you take a slice of a tuple, it gives you a smaller tuple that starts and ends at the bounds you specify. So yeah, there's like a tuple version of slicing.
But it looks like your list of tuples is a list though, with the brackets now.
Right. Yeah. So that was my original intention. It is a list, square brackets, of tuples, parentheses. So that's, yeah, that should be working as intended.
So is it best practice to use a tuple before you use a list? Like err on the side of using tuples rather than lists?
I mean, I guess so. Like if a tuple meets your needs, you should use a tuple instead of a list. But I would anticipate most commonly the reason why you have a list of values is because you need to add and remove items and change them and sort them.
Okay.
But yeah, generally speaking, you should use the simplest, least powerful tool that gets the job done. But I just think that most commonly you're going to need the power that lists provide.
Can you iterate over a tuple the same as a list?
Yeah, pretty sure that works exactly the same way. We're gonna get to looping a little bit later on in this lecture, so we can cover that then.
think it was Zach that was saying, how do we convert something from a tuple into a list? Or do we have to make a list, take all the values and iterate through it and add it to that, change something, and then iterate? Oh no, you can't even add that back to a tuple, I guess. But how would you just convert it between tuple and a list in the same variable or list or whatever?
So yeah, just use the list constructor.
Oh, okay.
Pass in whatever, and if it's able to, it converts it. I imagine it won't be able to do that in all cases. I don't know what this is going to do. Yeah. But yeah, in this case, it was able to figure out what I meant, and it converted the tuple into a list.
Okay, and you can do the reverse too, right? You can just put tuple days of the week to go back or whatever if it was trying to be changed.
Yep.
All right, cool. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, so next up, we're going to talk about dictionaries, which are very similar to objects in JavaScript. But before we do that, I think we should take a break. And before we do that, just want to give you all one last chance for questions, or one more chance for questions. Anything you're wondering about lists, or just anything in Python we've seen so far? No?
Are there any ways to make a string or number immutable for like a constant JavaScript?
So strings and numbers are actually already immutable. You can't like edit a number, it just replaces it with a different number. So if I say like, equals 4, then I say a number equals 5. I haven't actually changed 4 into 5. I have just redirected a number to point to a different value. So it doesn't refer to 4, it now refers to 5. Similarly with strings, if I say a string equals hello, then I say a string equals bye. I have not modified this string at all. I've just replaced it with a different string entirely. So another way we can see this, and I did this demo in JavaScript yesterday, but if I do a string 1 equals A, so I'm trying to reassign that E. String does not support item assignment. So JavaScript just does nothing silently. Python is a slightly saner programming language, and it actually tells you like, hey, you did something impossible.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
But as a convention, though, when you declare something that you don't want to change, you just declare it in all caps.
Yeah, that's a convention. I don't see that too super often, but I've definitely heard that before. So I don't think anyone would be surprised if you did it, or if you see it, then that's probably what it means.
Like pi for 3.14.
Yeah, that would be a good example. Oh, I just remembered one other thing I wanted to show you. So there's a little tricky bit of syntax if your tuple has one element in it. So look, for example, if we have a small list, just has the number 3 in it, we close it in square brackets, that's totally fine. If we have a small tuple, this is actually not valid syntax. Well, it is, but Python's going to get confused. Okay, so can you see what's wrong here with the output?
It's not in parentheses.
Yeah, it's not a tuple anymore, right?
Right. It's an integer. So when you have a tuple with one item in it, Python can't tell if it's a tuple or if you're using the parentheses for order of operations like Pemdas, you know. And so it thinks that this is just the mathematical operation just for inside of parentheses that you're doing before anything else here. So if you want to have a one item tuple, you have to put the trailing comma in there so that Python understands that it's not mathematical precedence and that this is actually a tuple of values. Question?
Could you that just matters with strings, right? I mean numbers. Like if you had a string in a tuple, just one string in a tuple, would it still print that in the parentheses?
It's an interesting question. I think it would still have problems. Yeah, so it still is used for like precedence or priority or whatever. So it's not a tuple. This is just a string in parentheses. The parentheses are basically doing nothing here. So we need the comma, and now it's a tuple.
Could you also put like how you can convert it to like an int or whatever? So could you just put tuple before the parentheses? Would that work as well?
Apparently.
Nice.
I'm not sure if that's the tuple I expected to get, but all right. Oh yeah, because I was saying before, it's like in JavaScript how strings are list-like objects. They have numerical indices to get you the individual letters. So I guess if you think about it like that a string is a list of letters, then converting the string into a tuple gets you the individual letters in their own elements. All right. So next data structure, we'll talk about dictionaries just briefly. But first, I think we should take a break. It's 11:05. Come back at 11:15, and we're going to learn about dictionaries. All right, class, welcome back. Hope you enjoyed your brief break. So now we're going to be learning about dictionaries. So a dictionary in Python is very similar to an object in JavaScript. But I want to point out that Python also has a data structure called objects, which is yet something else. We're going to cover that in a little bit of time when we learn object-oriented programming. All right, so a dictionary, roughly similar to an object in JavaScript. It's just a set of key value pairs. So without further ado, let's actually look at one. So just like in JavaScript objects, we create Python dictionaries using curly braces. And then we just type out a list of keys and their values. Although one difference you might notice immediately is that the keys need to have quotation marks around them. So this is not optional. Python demands this of us. Cool. And then we can access their properties in a very similar way to how we do in JavaScript using bracket notation. Let's access Alice's age. Note that in Python, you cannot use dot notation with dictionaries. This is a pretty significant, I mean, it's not huge, but it's something that you're probably going to get tripped up on at some point. This is the difference between Python and JavaScript.
So the only way to access is like that when you're trying to access it in Python.
Right, so this on line 73, that's going to crash. Dict object has no attribute age, it has a property age. It's a distinction that exists in Python. So we have to use bracket notation for accessing.
And with bracket notation, do you have to use the quotations inside of that too? So everywhere you use, you have to use it?
Right. If we want to access something by a variable, though, then we could do that without quotation marks. So for example, prop is a variable that refers to the string job. So if we look for Alice prop, that's going to get me the job property. She is an influencer. Cool. So we've covered lists, we've seen dictionaries. Those are kind of our two most fundamental data structures. If you want to have an ordered list of things or an unordered list of key value pairs, so you have names for your data. But sometimes we might want to combine these into one data structure. So something that you'll use very commonly is a list of dictionaries. Nathan, you have a question?
Just a quick one. Is it the same thing with the built-in methods like in JavaScript where there's certain ones that the dictionary has that are pretty much the same as JavaScript and the same ones from the array to the list for Python?
Python list methods are going to have equivalent methods to what you find in JavaScript. Figure anything you can do in JavaScript, you can do the same thing in Python, but it might be called something a little bit different. So you just have to know what you want to find. So for example, in JavaScript, there's a push method for adding items to the end of an array. In Python, we use a method called append, which does the same thing, it just uses a different word.
Okay, sounds good. And it's like the same as in like, an array is actually just an object with the method features that are built in the prototype, or whatever. Is it the same thing for Python? Is
No.
every list technically like an object or something weird like that?
Right, so in Python, dictionaries, lists, everything are actually their own types. It's much more formal and proper. Unlike, Python was like actually a deliberately designed language, whereas JavaScript, like we said before, was just built in a week. So there were some shortcuts taken.
Can you change the methods if you wanted to for prototypes for anything to get like overall behaviors different?
I mean, you can change the prototype methods. It's generally discouraged to do that for built-in methods though, but for your own classes, you could do that. That's getting a little bit deep into the weeds though. Okay, so we got a few different people here. Got Alice, Bob, he's 49. He's a dog walker. Carol, she's 65. She's a life coach. Cool. So now I've got a list of people. So this is kind of like the best of both worlds between storing a lot of details about one thing and storing a list of things. So if I want to say, let's say I want to print Bob's name, what do I need to type to get that?
So what was it? So it'd be print people one bracket quote age.
Name.
A name, yeah.
Or the name.
So yeah, we got some other logs here. Let's comment these out for clarity. Yeah, so people at one is this dictionary. And then people at one at name is this property right here. Cool. So that's Python dictionaries in a nutshell, just very similar to JavaScript objects. Jake?
Yes, would you mind just instead of people at one at name, could you do people at one at 0? I just kind of want to see what it says.
No, that wouldn't do anything productive because people at one is this object and it doesn't have a property on it called 0. So that should not do anything interesting.
So it wouldn't show like Bob or like name and Bob.
Nope.
Or...
Yeah, so key error 0. I asked it for an element 0 and it's like that doesn't exist here.
Got it. Thank you.
Yep. What other questions do we have?
So as far as the dictionary, let's say I wanted to access the actual name or have it compare the key value that we're using inside of the dictionary to whatever, how would I actually have it compare the key and not the value that's stored inside the key?
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
So for example, how we have name and then Carol. So right now we're accessing Carol. So like when we print it out and we put name on there, it just throws out Carol. And if we do people and then one, it's gonna sorry, it doesn't throw out Carol, it throws out Bob. And if we do people and one, it's gonna throw out the entire dictionary for Bob. So what I'm asking is how would we have it only print out the keys, not the values?
Yeah, it's a good question. So a little bit later on today, we're actually going to cover looping through objects. And so you'll see it's actually very similar to how we do it in JavaScript. You can do a loop through it and it'll get you the keys one at a time. But normally you should just know the keys up front. Like that's typically why we use dictionaries. All right, so let's move forward. So I'm going to talk about functions a little bit. So very similar to functions in JavaScript, kind of the biggest, most obvious differences is they are defined using the def keyword and must indent inside of your function because Python is white space sensitive. It does not use curly braces to mark the end of a function. So for example, use def, the name of the function, parentheses, and then a colon. And then under here, I indent. So everything that is indented is in the body of the function. So I'm just going to say that this function returns 5. Pretty simple function. And then we're going to see what it does. Print 5. What are we expecting to see here?
It probably won't, it won't show anything in the console log, or yeah, no, it shouldn't do anything.
So it doesn't call the function. I printed the function itself and Python's just like, yeah, that's a function. What about it? So I meant to call the function, putting those parentheses over there. So now it gives me 5. Note that this print statement is not part of the function because it's unindented. So as we're writing Python, using correct indentation is going to be essential. Although honestly, that's not really any different from JavaScript because no matter what language you write, you should always be using perfect indentation. You know, when you open up a function, open up a for loop, indent another level. Every time you have something inside of a thing, you should indent your code. It makes it much easier to read. So I would definitely recommend you indent your JavaScript code the way that you indent your Python code.
Oh, that part there where it has the memory location, does that ever come in useful? Like, yeah, has that?
Not in my experience. I'm sure
Okay.
some people make use of it, but I don't know what I would do with it.
Got it.
Dalton?
So I think I know, but if you were to do that same, like the exact same function in JavaScript, if you console logged it, but you only returned the 5, it would still print to the console, right? Because you're console logging the function, so it's going to print what you're returning from that function.
If I call the function and then print that, then yeah, whatever is returned, I'll see that in the console. All right, so let's see another example of a function here. One takes in an argument, n. So shouldn't be too surprising. Takes in an argument, we add 1 to it, returns it. So let's look at a function now with 2 arguments. So here we've written a function that takes multiple arguments. The position matters here. Tells me I have 3 blueberries. If we pass these in the wrong order, Python doesn't know where they're supposed to be. It just does exactly what we ask it to, puts them in the same order and says, I have black 5 berries. Doesn't make sense because I put, the color for N and I put the number for the color. But if we want to pass arguments in different orders, we can use named arguments. So I've named arguments N and color. They have default values also of 1 and blue. And then when I call it, I can specify which argument is which. So even though it's defined with N and then color, I can call it with color and then N, as long as I'm very clear about which one is which. So here, Python understands me. I have 3 raspberries. All right, now something that you don't necessarily need to do in your own code, but you might see this. So I just want to show it to you real quick. You can define a function that takes any number of arguments. So if the argument starts with a star, this means any number of positional arguments. Cool. So I didn't define this function as having 3 arguments. It just has one thing, star args. But then I can pass in any number of elements, and they get passed in to this function as a single tuple called args. So if you need to handle an unspecified number of arguments, this is one way. But honestly, I would prefer to just accept a list instead of an unspecified number of individual arguments. But sometimes this is what you want to do. So you have that option. And similarly, you can write functions that take any number of keyword arguments. So this is a keyword argument, which is going to be a dictionary. We'll talk more about loops in a minute, but this is how you loop through a dictionary. So this function has not been defined with any specific keyword arguments. I just said it can take any number of unspecified keyword arguments. And so when I called it, I decided I'm going to call it with name, age, and job. But whatever keywords I pass in, the function loops through them. I said,
You have an S in it, I think, when you declared it or put the argument when you were defining it. There's an S quargs, but the rest are quarg. Was that changing it or making it wrong?
yeah, so this is the dictionary I'm actually looping through that's passed in here. And then this is my loop variable that refers to an individual keyword argument. So that was the problem. Cool, so now it loops through and it is able to tell me, you know, just all the different properties about myself. All right, so that's all I got to say about functions. The
You
rest,
just
you
use
know,
those
pardon?
quark things to be silly, right? That's not any specific syntax.
Say again?
You just use the quark thing to be silly, right? That's not like actual syntax.
So the actual syntax is star and star star. I could have called this variable anything. Like I could have said star, you know, positional parameters and then star star keyword parameters.
Okay.
But for some reason, this is very conventional Python code. Quargs is just what people call the argument when they use star star keyword arguments. I definitely think it sounds really funny to say, especially when you have to access the dictionary using the loop variable with quargs at quarg. But that's Python for you.
I'm sorry, what did you call the whole thing again? Conditional parameter loop? Or what was it?
These are positional parameters.
Positional parameters. Okay.
And you're probably not going to need to use this too often, but if you see it, you should be able to recognize it. All right, so that's all I've got to say about functions. I want to show you a very brief example of an if statement, because again, this is going to be like 99% the same as in JavaScript. So I want to make a function that determines if you are old enough to be served beer, depending on where you live and how old you are. All right, so this is a pretty simple bar. Maybe they're not really doing their due diligence here, but the rules are that if you are over 21, you can be served alcohol, or if you are over 18 and you live in Canada, you can be served alcohol, or if you live in Antarctica at any age, you can be served alcohol because it's, you know, a lawless continent. I don't think anyone's going to stop you. But if you don't meet any of those criteria, you cannot be served alcohol. So just test that out real quick. All right, so if you're 20 in the USA, you cannot drink. It's the false. But if you are 21 in the USA or 18 in Canada or any age in Antarctica, then you can. So this should be pretty familiar to you. Biggest differences here are we use and or instead of and or. There's no parentheses around the if statement. And instead of else if, we have this keyword elif. But otherwise, it's like exactly the same. Was there a question?
Yes, I had a question. So for your or and statements, how does Python know to combine age and country like as one thing, like the age greater than or equal to 18 and country, and not the or? Like, would it make sense to put, like, why don't you need parentheses around like age and country and then have or like outside of that?
Mhm. I think it just naturally works out that the order of operations is what I want it to be. But yeah, it makes it more clear, I think, to write it like this. So I prefer that.
Thank you.
Yep.
On that same note, doesn't an or statement, won't that only execute once? Isn't that part of the reason why too?
What do you mean? Like either an and
Like-
or an or statement only executes once, just when we get to this line.
Oh yeah, so I guess that's really what I meant, because it's not like age is gonna go or age and then or again. So wouldn't it just be the however you write it, it's always essentially like I think you said 2 days ago, it's just always gonna go left to right anyways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm not so sure about this actually. Let's just say you should put parentheses around the logical conditions if you're not sure what happens first. It's good to be safe. All right, so moving on, the last topic for today, we're going to talk just a little bit about loops in Python. They're pretty simple, similar to JavaScript, but a little bit easier maybe. So this is very similar to the JavaScript for of loop. Sorry, I have too many print statements here.
Is it always going to be for? Is it always going to be for in? Is it never going to be for of, regardless if it's a list or object?
Right. Python doesn't have anything called for of. It's just for in.
Cool.
Yeah, JavaScript just has to be a little bit extra confusing with similarly named things. So yeah, for X in my list, print X. Amazing. Shows us those 3 items in the list. Sometimes you just need to print out a list of numbers, though. You don't have like a list pre-made. So there's a handy range function in Python. So we call range 10, and it basically creates a list with the numbers 0 to 10. Oh. So that can be useful for some, algorithmic challenges if you need to count up or do something repeatedly. That can be handy. But you might have noticed that we don't get access to I, the loop variable, the index. So if you want that, there's yet another way to loop in Python that lets you do that. So here I'm going to declare 2 loop variables, I, x in enumerate. So enumerate is a function you can call that turns the list into, it's almost like a dictionary of key value pairs with the index and the value. So now I can print both of these, and it'll show me both the index and the value. So that can be useful for some kind of algorithmic challenges where you need to loop through a list and know which position you're looking at. So you might have to enumerate. And then lastly, we're going to talk about looping through objects. Again, this is basically the same as doing it in JavaScript. So we're just going to show this real quick. Cool. So we loop through Alice. Print K and then print Alice at K. So it shows those names. Alice, age is 44. Her job is an influencer. Again, that should look pretty similar, pretty familiar. It's basically the same as how we do it in JavaScript. And then lastly, of course, there is also while loops, which work basically exactly the same as in JavaScript. The syntax is almost exactly the same.
So real quick, what prevents you in Python from having like any protected type of variables that you can't change? Like for example, like constant JavaScript. What if you accidentally like reassign a variable or something? Will it like freak out or like what's the protection on that?
Not sure if there is any. So yeah, there isn't like a really simple equivalent of const in Python. So I don't know, like a really easy way offhand to just prevent reassignment like that, but it shouldn't be too big of an issue in general. All right. So that's Python in a nutshell. That's the basics of it. That's enough for you to get started on the homework, which should look pretty familiar. We're going to give you a lot of the same challenges. You did them in JavaScript. Let's do them again in Python. Yeah, so what questions do we have? Nathan?
Yeah, hey, I got a question about the range. Is there an easy way to reverse that? When you declare instead of, when you did range, it went like 1 through 9. Would there be an easy way to reverse that going 9 to 1, counting down?
Probably.
It seems kind of weird that you're forced to go from index 0 to a number rather than like in JavaScript, when you type in your for loop, you can determine where to start, where to end, and which direction to go in. Seems much more strict.
Yeah, this is a little different than how we do it in JavaScript. So there's a function built into Python called reversed. And then we'll turn that back into a list, because a range object is not actually a list. It's a list-like thing. Cool. So now I have my backwards list. my backwards range, whatever.
Excellent. Thanks.
Cool.
And
Is
if you got
reverse
rid of the
something that-
list, it would just print the numbers outside of a list, right?
Pardon?
If you got rid of that list keyword there, it would just print the numbers outside of a list, right?
If I didn't have the list keyword, it would give me a range instead of a list, which is very similar, but it's not exactly the same thing.
Can you print that?
So that's all we see there. Not too informative.
Oh, okay.
Mhm.
I have a question about that reverse function.
Yep.
Does that only work on ranged? Or can you just like throw anything into reverse and then it reverses the right?
It should work on
data type?
any ordered thing.
Okay, thank you.
I'm guessing that with range, you can put in, I mean, you do range 10, which is telling it where to stop. But I imagine you can do range 1, 10 to say go from 1 to 10 rather than starting at 0. You can indicate a starting point, right?
Yeah, that's how it works.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, that is how it works.
Okay.
Wait, actually, hold on. Now that you mention that,
Can you indicate the? Oh, okay. So it looks like you can actually.
You can do a
indicate the
third,
increments as well.
Yeah, you can pass a third thing that shows how many steps. So if you do like, if you want to do like 1, 10, 2, it would start at 1 and go up 2 increments every time. And if you want to go backwards, you can just do -1 and then it goes
Got
back.
it. Okay.
Okay.
So you put your parameters in the range. Gotcha.
Oh, what? -1. So I guess that's how you do a backwards range. It's kind of an interesting syntax. I don't know. I don't use range every day. What other questions do we have? No other questions? Going once, going twice. All right, cool.
What's
Thank you
the,
very-
sorry, one thing, what's the best resource? Sorry, one last thing. For like Mozilla was the main one to use for that. What do you recommend for like the main resource when you have to look up all these built methods to do these challenges and stuff?
Docs.python.org is pretty good.
Okay, that's the main one you use? Okay,
Yeah.
sweet. Thank you.
There's other websites and occasionally blogs and stuff. And then we get to Django. There's Django specific documentation. Yep. What other questions have we got? Going once, going twice. All right. Thank you very much, everybody.